Hello, everyone. My name is Hannelie, and I'm from the Possibility Gap, and today I'm joined by Cathryn Barnard. We call her Cat, and her partner Pat can unfortunately not join us today, but he's here with us in spirit, and they're from Working the Future. So welcome, Cat. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today as part of the World Futures Day celebrations on the 1st of March. So
Thank you for inviting me.
yeah, so thank you for coming and for sharing your wisdom with us today. So I'm curious, tell us a bit about yourself and also what inspired you to begin working the future and what's that all about? So it's a mouthful already.
Okay. Where to begin? I am based in the UK, not far out of London, and I have been running Working the Future since early 2017, and we set the business up because we recognized that there was an urgent need to educate and inform business leaders and owners on the trends that were going to disrupt and transform the way that we work. And at that point, obviously pre-pandemic, those trends were out there in the literature, but not available in a condensed, accessible fashion. And we'd just experienced our Brexit referendum vote here in the UK. So when I had my light bulb moment, it was several weeks, literally just several weeks after the referendum result. And I looked at these trends in the round and thought, my goodness, these are going to make Brexit look like a tea party. And the reason why I was interested in the future of work trends is that prior to that, I had spent 20 odd years working in the staffing sector and specifically in the communications technology staffing sector. So I started my career in 1994 and I went to work for an agency that specialized in telecommunications. And more by luck, a lot more by luck than judgment, I arrived there just as the European telecommunications sector was deregulating. So ostensibly what that meant was that up until the early 1990s, each country in Europe had one state-owned operator. Deregulation meant that each country could auction off licenses to open up competition. And so for me, as a young, ambitious 20-something-year-old, what that meant was that I was working for an outsourced provider that was putting together the teams of engineers who designed, built, and launched the second and third generation mobile phone networks across Europe. So I had a high octane decade plus career of traveling around Europe, putting teams together, watching them do their work. I was also really fortunate. I got two opportunities to set up entire recruitment functions, once for Orange in Switzerland and once for Three in Sweden. Um, which obviously gave me a huge wealth of experience. And I think the one thing that we often cannot do is to synthesize all the knowledge and
Mhm.
experience that we're gaining in the moment. It's only after the event that we can see what length and breadth of knowledge and wisdom we have acquired. But what I realized with hindsight is that my lifelong interest lies in understanding how humans perform well together in pursuit of shared outcomes. So for me, I think that goes beyond work
Mhm.
because work sits on a spectrum of highly engaging to highly disengaging, depending on all manner of variables. What I'm most curious about are the variables that lead to the intention that people have to do great things together, to bring new things into existence, whether that is art, whether it's product, whether it's a service, whatever it is. I'm interested in the human factors that entice and mobilize humans to achieve great things together. And so working the future is today principally an advisory firm that advises on the trends that are transforming work, but underneath that, our consulting work is grounded in the principles of how do we create environments where people can do brilliant, engaging work that brings out the best in them.
That's amazing. So as you're speaking, I'm wondering what your current self would say to your younger self, who started off, like you say, like very exciting, with all these incredible opportunities about the world of work. Would you have advised her something different when you were younger to do differently, or do you see just as a progression, a dynamic path that we're taking off to where you are today? And it's fascinating also, the year 2017 seems to have been a catapult for many, many new innovations and creations of people doing different things. So it's fascinating.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question that you ask because, yes, I absolutely can point to a number of things that I would have said to my younger self, but then in equal measure, had I been available to talk to my younger self, I'm not entirely certain that my younger self would have heeded the advice of a wise elder, and nor am I sure that I should have done, because your wisdom comes through the experience of the circumstances in which you find yourself, right?
Right. So now you're already leading to another question. That's beautiful. You're just talking about that balance between the young, I would call it enthusiasm, excitement, also at almost adventurous spirit, and then the experience with the generational gaps that we have. Because it seems like these generation gaps are just, they're expanding. It's like the generation gap between boomers and X's and X's and Y's and the millenniums and then Gen Z's. It seems like those gaps are, as we are progressing in the world now in the 21st century, that those gaps are expanding because what they want from life is very different from what we wanted. So how do you marry those two? That you can harvest the greatness of both.
So immediately, two thoughts spring to mind. One is none of us must underestimate the impact that the technology of the last 25 years has had on us socioculturally. Gen Z is the first generation to have entered the workplace that has grown up almost entirely digital. So it's always a bit tricky, isn't it? So I think if I understand it correctly, millennials comprise those who were born between 1980 and the early 2000s, and then Gen Z, early 2000s to I think 2012. But if you look at then Gen Z, we already had the internet before before the oldest Gen Zers were born. And so their access to information has always been far superior to older millennials. slash, certainly I'm a Gen Xer, right? So, you know, if I wanted information, I had to go to the public library to find out what I wanted to find out. So, first thing is that we have to be hyper aware of the landscape in which Gen Zers have grown up in. And I think that is true for all generations. But I would also say, I think the media is very manipulative, and it seeks always to work with quite lazy archetypes and tropes, and B, bluntly, as we stand today in 2025, I think it's abundantly clear that a strong cohort of our media is oriented towards clickbait and the dispersion of fear and divisiveness and anger. And so there's an inherent undercurrent that would seek to pit us all against one another. And whereas what I'm interested in, and I know you're interested in because we've had these conversations previously, what are the things that unite us? What are the threads of shared humanity? And there's so much more to unite us than there is to divide us. All of that said, going back to the point that I made that made you ask your question, I think, and I say this now as a woman in my 50s, so some degree of experience and wisdom, maybe. I think we all have to travel our own path, and I'm not sure what good it does any of us to be told how to do something or what to do by an elder person. I certainly, and it's an interesting point because actually when I was in my 20s, I didn't have access to female mentors in the way that female mentors are available to younger women today. It just wasn't a thing. But equally, I think about the sage advice that my parents gave me that I blatantly ignored. So
I think it's a two-edged sword, you know, it's the best of both worlds, so to speak, and to interweave those two worlds and to see what comes out of it. And I think that makes life interesting, because then we can expand our perception, we can explore new ways, we learn to also be together in a different way. Like you just said earlier, how do we share the space? How do we create those spaces for people to flourish? And not only from our own point of view, but also to learn from them as well. So I think it's this flow of movement all the time, especially now when hierarchies are beginning to fall. You know, we can see that a lot of companies are taking out some of the management level, for example. But that creates a gap because the people didn't have, for example, the experience to self-lead, for example. So it creates all kind of very interesting things. So there's lots happening in the world. So how do you foresee the future of work if you look at it from this moment in 2025, looking forward? Do you think it's going to be I would want to call it the embryonic space for something extraordinary to birth that we can't even see what it's yet?
I think, well, I can see several things happening. So the date that we're recording is the 19th of February. And in the past week, in the past few days, Saudi Arabia has convened a meeting between the United States and Russia to discuss the future of Ukraine, which Ukraine hasn't been invited to. And that is highly uncomfortable. That's really, really strange. And the United States government seems to be enthrall to the richest man in the world who is exhibiting psychopathic tendencies left, right, and centre, and clearly has issues with women and clearly has issues with minority ethnic groups and minority
identity
sexuality
groups.
preference groups. I mean, minority groups in general. And so I think if we wanted to, the easier option would be to comply with the idea that the future of work will be increasingly AI centric, but in parallel, I see a rising tide of activism standing up and confronting extreme capitalism and the myopic blindness with which that extreme capitalism refuses to acknowledge the externalities that the extrapolative nature of that capitalism presents. We cannot continue this trajectory of growth and consumption. We have reached the brink of what can be in that realm, and we are yet to experience the fallout of all of that extraction and all of that consumption. So I think we're really at a fork in the roads right now. I think we need courageous, brave hearts who are curious and who are not afraid to imagine very different working futures. It won't be easy. I can see lots of ways in which we are going to need to internalize simpler, less materialistic lives in order to move through this chaos that we have created for ourselves. And I think there will be many people that are so tied up in the current status quo that they will not be able to let go with ease of their reality. But in equal measure, I see many hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, who have been so disadvantaged by the current system and the status quo. It's not okay that a tiny, tiny pocket of the world's richest people continue to get ever richer and the rest of us become poorer. I actually don't believe that any of us beyond the world's poorest need all of the stuff that they are led to believe they need by modern market economies. I don't believe stuff does make you happier. I think love and friendship and truth and art and wonder make you happy. So it's an interesting one, really, Hannelie, because I can talk you through all the trends that I think are going to continue to play out over the next 5 or 10 years, or we can look at some of the bigger things which would bring us as a humane species back more into touch with one another.
No, earlier I was just sitting. Thank you for sharing that. I was just sitting, and what came up was you mentioned it now, the whole thing about capitalism, small percentage of the world who has all the material wealth. I'll call it material wealth because it's not prosperity. And then that link to the world of work, there's direct link between them if we look back in history, why we work and what was impacting our perception, our mindsets. Because, for example, in the agriculture era, the world of the farmer was very different from in the industrial area, the world of the factory worker. They had different intentions. They worked for a different reason. They had different threats that would cause them to struggle. They orientated themselves differently, and they need different skills. So that in mind, I think where we are in the world right now is that relook at the thing called money and what we measure. Like, how do we measure prosperity? Because we don't measure prosperity, we measure profits and performance and productivity and all such things, which is industrial era type thinking. It's not modern day type thinking, but it's still, it's now drawn into AI as well, that AI must now be more productive. It will be more productive than a human being. But then what does it leave us as human beings? And like you say, what is our shared commonalities then? Where will this take us as a species? But it is to really look at, because I was thinking about it the other day, we are the only species who pay to live. That's crazy if you really think about it. So have we been so blinded that we have to pay to live? And no other animal or species do that. It's just us. Because we created this commodity, this way of currency of measuring our wealth. But wealth is not the same as prosperity. Wealth is your hoarding. You want to contain. Because the richest man in the world today can sort out all the problems that you just spoke about in terms of poverty and the likes. But what does that help that individual, for example, to have all that so-called material wealth? But that's not prosperity. Prosperity is something that grows. It's like a plant. It's like a plant that continues to the seed that grows and it creates fruit. And then the land goes and rests before we plow the ground again, the soil that it can reoxygenate, and then we plant new seeds, and then the cycle continues like in nature. It's just as human beings have this in-out system, which we currently measure our performance, how well we do on.
And that system, I'm not a historian, but that system is less than 600 years old, isn't it? I mean, it's a very, very modern system. And as much as I've read about it, modernity began, in the 1700s, maybe? But if you look at what we don't speak about when we think about modernity, and we look at enslavement and colonialism, and certainly through a UK lens, empire, well, a European lens, I should say, actually, because I know there in South Africa, your history is more tied to the Netherlands. But, you look at what we don't talk about when we talk about modernity, and it's some pretty grisly human behavior based on hatred and othering and violence and extraction and theft. It's not pretty.
But if you think about that, why is that? It's the fear, it's a lack-based consciousness. It's fear of not having enough. So you have to conquer. If you're really going to look at it, why do you need to do that? If you think you have enough, why do you need to do that? So it's a human being thing. It's an inner world thing that's completely out of balance. Because if you are,
it's also rooted in fear of other, that person that well, as a for instance, I mean, what do I know? But you know, let's imagine for a minute that you are a 16th or 17th century explorer and you've set sail from wherever you've set sail from, and you are at sea for days and weeks, and suddenly you see land in sight, and you make your way towards it, and you rock up and you disembark, and you are greeted with another human being, and you recognize them as a human being because they are bipedal, you know, 2 arms, 2 legs. Physiologically, they look, for the most part, like you, but their skin is a different color. They're wearing very, very different clothes. They don't speak your language. They are carrying things that you've never seen before, but they look like they could be weapons. How are you going to respond to that situation? And that fear of other is kind of, it's hardwired into our DNA, isn't it? It's the way in which we have survived as a species for so long, because our brains are constantly, subconsciously, unconsciously sorting out what is safe and what is dangerous. And that is a real basal instinct, isn't it? What is safe, what's dangerous, and deciding and labeling something as other helps us feel some sense of control over the circumstance in which we find ourselves, because we've somehow identified whether we're in danger or not. Whether we are or not is immaterial. It's this sense that you have been able to distinguish a threat or not.
I've got an interesting perspective on that you just shared. If I now think back in history, the threat to the farmer was nature. It was the elements. You can't control the elements. You need rain to plant seeds. And then with the industrial era, because they used a lot of people in the factories, disease was a problem, was a big threat. Then if you look at, you know, in the information age, the 20th century, technology and the knowledge age, a different threat to them, the human again. And now where we are now, what do you think is the biggest threat to us, to our existence? Because it's us, because we are destroying the planet. The beautiful place that we live on that feed us. Now, if I think of that, is there a progression in that threat, or is it coming back to the human? You know, it's like we are sort of pushed to look back at ourselves, that we can interrogate what is this thing about, what you just shared about othering, that fear. Is it not perhaps what's happening in the world to really make us look at ourselves, even though, like you said, a lot of people won't, because they are so attuned to the status quo, they don't ask questions, they don't think for themselves. Yet the younger generations are asking a lot more questions. They are a lot more curious, and they want to know things that we didn't want to know when we applied for a job, for example. They are a lot more inquisitive, and some of them have a better sense of co-creating a better world for all. They think the older generations destroyed the planet, not them. So there's that anger as well, that intergenerational anger. What did you do to our home? And we're paying the price for that. And I think each generation can say that of the previous one in some way, for whatever reason, but not in this way where it's really affecting our future. So when I look at that, then I wonder if what's happening right now, yes, it's like you say, it's not easy, it's not nice, but isn't it to shake up things that won't be too stagnant for so long? And like you said, in the view of modernity, that we got so comfortable in that. That's now we had to be shaken up, that something else can be birthed. And it's our humanity that keeps us together. It's a shared thing. We all see the same sun and stars. We eat from the same earth. It's not that that person looks different from me. It's from a different, even though they have a different culture and do things very differently, they still see the same as we see at night and the sun in the morning. It's the same seasons, might be different in different regions. But isn't it for us to come back to our basics then as human beings? What is this that we share? You breathe, I breathe. You see, I see. It's just how we see is different, perhaps. But we have the same senses that we experience life through, but we apply them differently. So
yeah. I mean, I think environmentalists have been banging, the warning drum for years and years. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was written 50 years ago, wasn't it? Published 50 years ago. I'm not sure that I know why we are waking up right now, but I do know that most people that I speak to have a sense of anxiety that they can't articulate clearly. And I would wager that part of that anxiety comes from a deep loneliness because we've become so disconnected from one another. And, when you were talking earlier just then about kind of a shared humanity and all coexisting under the same stars at night or the same sun, moon, etc., I was also thinking about all the other biological creatures that exist on the planet that we have no regard for, that we are exterminating and extincting in pursuit of more. And the more isn't making us happy, the more isn't, we're buying stuff that we can't afford to impress people that we don't like. That was a line in a movie, wasn't it? Fight Club back in the 1990s. It's become its own meme. And what is the answer? I don't know what the answer is. I come back to my belief that we are at a fork in the roads, and I am encouraged and enlivened by the idea, which I suspect is more than an idea, that there is a rising tide of people who are no longer willing to uphold the status quo. It's interesting. I was looking just this morning. I have friends in America and they're telling me about protests taking place in every single state, and yet we're not hearing about any of that in the UK media.
Also not here.
And there is a month of boycotts being arranged on social media to boycott the brands in the United States that have rolled back on their DE and I initiatives. And those are being ardently upheld by people of colour, people from within the LGBTQ plus community. And I say, bring it on, bring it on. We have more agency than we think, because this man-made construct of money is what those with power are most concerned about holding on to. And what if we could create other systems of value that weren't extrapolative, that were far more in balance with the planet and nature, and that were prioritized towards feeding the human soul and enriching life. And I think that is doable. I mean, I think it's a massively broad spectrum, and there won't be a one size fits all, but there should never have been a one size fits all because every single element of nature is diverse. You know, I am not a symmetrical human being. My cells aren't identical to your cells. We are all different. We are all snowflakes in that regard, in the uniqueness of us all. And so the organizations that we might choose to build for ourselves and the ways of working that we might adopt moving forward don't need to be homogenous. They just need to be founded on principles and values that are good and whole and pure and in service to not singularly our species, but life on Earth.
For the greater good, yes. But I do feel also, I mean, in the last, for me, myself, I can only speak for myself, obviously, but in the last, I would say 15 years, 15 to 20 years, you could see I mean, you play with trends all the time, but from a human perspective, one can see that something has been happening. And I know, Rudolph, there's a person who speaks about morphic resonance. So people begin to gravitate towards each other who have similar principles and value systems. And it goes beyond social media and technology. Through synchronicity, people just get to know each other, and they come into the same space, and they have the same value systems, and they live according to the same principles. So I do think it's doable what you said, that we can co-create a completely whole new, like you say, it doesn't need to be the same for everyone, that is possible. But I think that started to happen, but then people get pulled into the old system, the old way of thinking, because they don't have enough support to do that. Because I always said, but we have these amazing echo chambers online, ecosystems in the entrepreneurial world, yet, and if you look at how many entrepreneurs there is in the world currently, it's fascinating if they all just come together in such a way, begin to get together with each other and support each other, and not these, like what's happening now in the States with boycotts and likes, then we can transform wherever we are and in whatever community we find ourselves. But people don't do that. We speak about collaboration, we speak about co-creation, but there's something keeping people from that. And I'm always fascinated by that. And in the entrepreneurial world, people have to collaborate. They have to, it's a very different mindset than working for a company, for example, as an employee. So I do think that technology can perhaps help us with that. AI can perhaps help us to get that done better, because currently it's not there yet. Technology doesn't do that for us. I'm not talking about social media, but that we can in pockets. And that brings me to something about what I know you guys are doing. You have a community of practice for distributed work. And that's exactly it, where people can come together because it's new. We have to have a safe space that's very creative, that we can experiment with new ways of doing things. And you have that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit more about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, actually, that you bring that up. So we set up a community of practice in November 2023 to invite people who had an interest in shaping the future of work, not just an interest in the future of work, but who regarded themselves as pioneers in the future of work and the future of distributed asynchronous working. And we are 15, 16 months in now, and there's 100 of us, and we are learning from one another every day. what I've learned about hosting a community of practice is, well, several things. One is that is a living adaptive system. So actually, it's not something to be managed. It's not something to be led. It evolves itself. I think the other thing that I've learned is that even though on the one hand, I know more than many about the trends transforming work, when I meet online and have conversations about the future of work with members of that community, I realize how little it is that I know, because context is everything. And therefore, I think I can have deep knowledge, but I'm cautious about calling myself an expert, and I'm very cynical about anybody that calls themselves a future of work expert. I just think that's self-anointed PR froth. How can you be an expert on something that hasn't happened yet?
Exactly. I say it all the time as well. There are no experts currently about that. We're all learning together. We're in the mills of learning together and discovering together.
But it's a really interesting / beautiful thing to behold. And actually, with events since November of 2024, it is a safe space where people can come and share their concerns, their hopes, their fears. And actually, I think we possibly are arriving at a point where social media isn't working for most of us. It's, there's great research coming out of the United States, the work of Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues, looking at the way in which social media is damaging younger minds. Sherry Turkle has looked at the way in which social media is breaking down our ability to communicate with one another. There are others. Jean Tweng's done some really interesting work on what she calls iGen and the impact of technology on younger people. The loneliness epidemic. We have loneliness epidemic across the developed world. I can't speak for whether or not there is a similar epidemic in the developing world, but I suspect it's prevalent wherever populations have smartphones. So for my money, that's probably a terribly inappropriate phrase for a podcast like this, but to my mind, we need safe spaces where we can meet and convene and feel safe and share. I'm not even sure whether some of the community do share the projects that they're working on, things that they find interesting. I think we're collectively sense-making together. And there's nothing as delightful as being able to tap into a community and say, for instance, I'm planning to try and move as much of our workplace tech away from US-based companies. What can you recommend? And, it's the neighborhood recommendation of old, isn't it? So I don't know whether I've answered your question because it's so very emergent. I have been thinking about it recently, and I have just finished writing a blog, which I will publish soon, about what I think I've learned about facilitating a community of practice after 16 months of having done so.
There's a dear friend of mine, they already in the early 2010s, they were really big in ecosystem development in Europe. And I would say also parts of Western Asia. And they had a fascinating experience as well. Now, we live in a different time now, but there was something about it because of all the distractions and all the calls for our attention, because we live in an attention economy, is that they found that it was easy setting it up, easy in inverted commas, to get people on board. It was not such a difficult thing for them to do, but it was to keep people coming back, because there's just so much that people wouldn't come back and stay and build it together. You know, it's like they come in, they see what they can get, and then they're off to another one, or they're going off elsewhere and doing something different. So they had many lessons that they learned from it, but I do feel also we live in a different time now where people are needing that more than then. That loneliness that you spoke about wasn't there then. And even on a professional level, if you wanted to speak to someone, you could reach out to them. But today there's this hesitance because of all that's happening, and because of the othering and the polarization and the likes. But I have a sense that we are shifting to something that might be called relational media, not social media. So it's having a deep discussion with somebody. It's not just a like on somewhere or a comment here and there on something. It's having a deep discussion about existential questions that, you know, that impact us all, especially in terms of where we share our talents and gifts and how we organize ourselves and how we do things together. And they also had exchange. They also had exchange, that you can exchange your talents and gifts with others who need it. And they had the whole setup, technology-wise, everything. And they were funded by the EU. And I know how much money the EU gave them, because my friend was involved in getting them that money. So I would say there's money around for stuff like this, especially in the EU. I can't say for the UK now, but being thrown at things like that to establish that. But I think we can all learn from each other as we go ahead on how we can maybe do it better and how we can improve it. But the first thing is people must just come together.
Yes, and I think, you know, in the early days of the internet, I think we all had high hopes. I think we all had high hopes that it would be a tool for good. And I think there are brilliant things that have happened as a consequence of the internet. But I also think, look, you don't need many bad actors to twist things and for things to then take a dark turn. And I wonder what part relational media might play as we have to wake up to malevolent forces that aren't singularly after all the rare resources that exist in Ukraine. They're after a massive land grab for the whole of Europe. And what will be decided? Will it be the case that remilitarization is prioritized over and above these budgets that are made available for projects such as you describe? Will it have been deemed the case that that was an experiment, that's the end, the budget's pulled, let's go full on remilitarization? Or will there be an adjacent budget that is made available to harness the internet as a force for good in the fight back against this minority group of bad actors? Putin isn't the whole of Russia. Donald Trump isn't the whole of the United States. We have to connect the people with good hearts and honourable intentions who are socially minded to one another in order to imagine better futures. And I think that the internet as a tool brings us the gift of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary thinking that
Polymathic
transcends
thinking,
borders.
Polymathic thinking.
Yeah.
So, Kat, thank you. I want to ask you, considering the trends that you are involved, that you are hunting every day, and that you are the insights that you share with your clients and with companies and entrepreneurs and businesses. If you look at those trends, now this may be an interesting question then. How do we prepare people for those because a trend is something that one has to look in its entirety. You can't just take a piece out. We don't live in silos and can't look at it in a reductionist way. So we have to look at it as a whole. How do we prepare people for that? Especially the younger generations in terms of how they look at creating a life for themselves.
I'm not sure I know the answer to the question fully. I mean, I guess the question that I would ask anybody expressing an interest in trends is to constantly think about the context in which we're operating, because you're right, nothing exists in isolation, nothing at all. Everything is interconnected. So, if you want to understand work trends, you have to think about education, you have to think about technology, you have to think about social care, you have to think about demographics, you have to think about birth rates, death rates, the climate crisis, transportation, natural disasters, geopolitics. So I guess, how do we prepare people to think about the trends? I guess I would start by saying you can't look at things in silos. You have to look at the relatedness of all things.
And that requires a mindset change as well.
Mm.
To really help people think differently. Because I don't know how to think differently. I think there's a lot of impotent thinking, what I call impotent thinking at the moment, narrow-mindedness and impotent thinking, and to create spaces where people can really explore different types of thinking, that they can just see the world in a different way, that they can see this bigger picture. Because it's when you're inside of it, it's very difficult to see outside of the frame when you're in the picture.
Yeah.
To take people out of, and that's why your community, for example, your community of practice is so powerful, because you take people out of their normal daily lives in a safe space where you are continuously cross-pollinating and catalyzed and stimulated and nourished by other people who experience much the same stuff in the world, but in a different way. Like you say, context is everything. Context management is a lot more important than anything else at the moment. And to see it in perspective, and then to take a distance from it, and then to look at what is really going on here, and to be curious, just to be curious by itself, to just stay curious. And like I said, ask questions, and don't just accept everything for what it is on the surface.
And create the space for yourself to think about
the time and the
things.
space. Yeah. So I think for a modern day leader, that will be one of the first things, is create space that you can have the time to do that, because everything is so fast. Everything is the speed, the efficiency, quickness, and more money, more profits for the bottom line, those type of things. And I think that's where it's all starting to crash. But I do believe there's hope that something beautiful will grow out of it. But we just need to come together. People who are thinking this way must come together.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Kat. This was wonderful. I can speak with you for hours about this, literally, because you have also lots of wisdom from where not only your experience, how you see the world, and the questions you ask. people don't want to ask those questions. They're not easy questions. But people are afraid to say publicly what they feel because of vindication and the likes. But
I think also
we have to step
we live
beyond
in a
that.
time where we've been conditioned to believe that we need answers to the questions, but actually, I don't believe that is so. I think the questions are the important bit.
Now, living the question rather than looking for an answer, and look at the possibilities that can come out of that. But then you already start. I think we're gone past the time when we're looking to fix problems, because then our attention is still on the problem. Whereas with us, we're looking at the future. Thank you so much, Kat. We will share your contact information at the end of this video and the audio as well, that people can reach you and hear more about all the wonderful things that you do at Working the Future. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me to come and chat with you.